I want to welcome you all to strategy session number 2, the Spin City, communicating the case for reform. Before we get started, I do want to mention that we do have evaluation forms, and we really like to have them filled out. And there will be staff, once again, with the red badges that will be available to take them up from you at the end of the meeting. Your room hosts are John and myself, so if you need anything, you can come over and ask us for some help. I also want to let you know that we're very thankful that all of you have come from around the country, and some have even come from around the globe, and we're very thankful for all of that. Before we get started, I want to let you know that whenever we do the questions, there is a microphone in the middle of the room, so you can just go to the middle of the room and ask the questions from there unless you feel like your voice carries so well that you can do it from your seat. And I think Mr. Moore will just join us. Our lead panelist today is Dana Perino, and she does not need any introduction. Most of you know her from her work at the White House, and now she's a Chief Issues Counselor with Burston and Marsteller. So if you will, please welcome Ms. Dana Perino.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. When she was talking about those evaluation forms, I said to Michelle, yep, it's important to be tested, and then you got to see how you measure up. Thanks for coming today. I think I was looking at as the room started filling up, and you realize that the issue of education reform, improving it, is one that is obviously near and dear to your hearts, but it is at the root of everything that we want to accomplish in our country. I heard a statistic the other day that kind of shocked me, that something like, you guys will probably know the exact number, but somebody said like 30% of the 9th and 10th graders in the country drop out. Like, seriously? Like, what do they do? It was hard for me to imagine. And then I realized, like, oh my gosh, I'm so disconnected from it. I don't have children. And I live in the District of Columbia. And obviously I read a lot about all the great things that Michelle Rhee is trying to accomplish here, and the challenges that she has to deal with, and have the full support. She has my full support. When I worked for President Bush, obviously this was his signature domestic issue. In fact, it was what he was focused on the day that our country changed forever, on 9/11, and he was there in Florida at a school. And No Child Left Behind obviously left a mark, and I think it was a consequential enough piece of legislation that now we're able to have these discussions about how to improve it, change it, and with President Obama's announcement for Race to the Top, there's a lot of similarities there, but we'll talk a little bit about that today. So I'm delighted to be here. I hope that I can foster a good discussion amongst our panelists, who are fabulous. I'm going to first introduce Michelle Bernard, who is the president and CEO of the Independent Women's Forum, and she'll have a chance to more fully introduce herself and give you a couple of points of view right before we get started. And Joe Williams, who is the executive director for Democrats for Education Reform. And then we're going to have Steve Moore, who is an editorial writer at the Wall Street Journal, and somebody that I have known, I'm embarrassed to say now, since 1995. Every time I just came from another speech where they sort of ran through my bio, and I realized, I'm like, wow, I'm getting old. That's a long list. So before Steve gets here, I think what we'll do is go ahead and do these 2 opening remarks, and then we'll just get right into questions. I have a few that I'd like to ask the panelists to talk about, but we, amongst ourselves, decided that the best way to make this interactive is to make sure that you have a chance to ask questions as well. So there's a microphone in the middle of the room, and that way we'll make sure that everybody gets a chance. So Michelle, you want to start?
Okay, yeah. I was just telling Dana earlier, I really like to get to the meat of things really quickly, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time at all reintroducing myself. But as Dana said, I'm president and CEO of the Independent Women's Forum. We are a think tank, a free market think tank made up of women scholars, and now 2 male scholars have joined us here in Washington, D.C. I'm also a political analyst for MSNBC, most frequently appearing on Hardball with Chris Matthews. On September 20th, the Independent Women's Forum had the honor of hosting a program tying education reform to personal responsibility and health issues called About Our Children. I hosted the program live on MSNBC. And despite being up against the New York Giants versus the Dallas Cowboys, we came in second in the ratings. So that goes to show that you can have a serious discussion about education policy that the American public will watch on television. And with that, I will turn it over to Joe Williams, and hopefully we'll get to the meat of things pretty quickly.
Yeah, in that spirit, I'll try to be quick also. I am the Executive Director of Democrats for Education Reform. But before that, I was a journalist. I was an education reporter at the New York Daily News, before that at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, before that the Milwaukee Sentinel, and started writing about education in 1990. So I've seen things shift quite a bit. And I made the transformation from journalism into the advocacy work that I'm doing right now because I found as a reporter to be writing these stories about outrageous things in the system that wasn't working for kids. And you can get on the front page of a newspaper like the New York Daily News and get a lot of buzz from it, but essentially it was falling upon ears of people who didn't really believe that anything could be changed. And so as we're going to be talking about getting the word out, I want to actually strike an optimistic note. I think we're actually getting the word out better now than we ever had about the need for reform. And my theory on why it's working is we've got better messengers now than we've ever had. And this has been a serious shortfall on the education reform world. Happy to dive into that concept a little bit later when we get into this. And thanks for being here.
Steve, would you mind? This is Steve Moore. I introduced you when you weren't here. Were your ears burning?
They were.
If you would just introduce yourself, and then we're gonna just hop right into questions.
So, do you want to start with questions? Or
Nope. I think you should give a little bit more about yourself
sure.
and your background.
I am Steve Moore. I am the economics writer for the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which I hope you all read regularly. I'm an economist. I'm not an education expert, but I just thought I'd just talk for 3 or 4 minutes about why I think this is so critically important to our country's economic future. And I thought I'd relate a story to you about one of the fun things about working at the Wall Street Journal is that we get visited at the editorial page by, some of the leaders around the world. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, Dana, we were visited by the chief economic minister for China, who was like the number 4 or 5 person in the chain of command. And it was a very striking conversation that we had with him because he was talking about how, China, they're kind of feeling their oats right now. They've had 10 to 12% growth rates for 8 to 10 years. They're looking at the United States and the huge hole that our economy is in. And, he was a bit arrogant. He said that, we're going to keep growing like this, and in 10 or 15 years, we're going to pass you all by in the United States, and essentially saying, we're going to leave the United States in our dust. And it made me think a lot about the fact that what they are really concentrated on in China is economic competitiveness. And by the way, I think you'd all be proud of me because I told the foreign minister, I said, Mr. Minister, with all due respect, China is not going to overtake the United States for one good reason, and that is our Chinese are a lot smarter than your Chinese are. But it made me think that, but it is true that they are really focused like a laser beam on economic competitiveness. And there's 2 issues for our country over the next 50 years that eclipse all others, in my opinion, Dana. One is, what you worked on is winning the war against terrorism. We have to win the war against terrorism if we're going to survive as a nation. The second is, who is going to be the global economic superpower of the next 50 years? And it's between 2 countries, the United States and China. And I guess my message is we cannot maintain our position as the hub of the global economy if we're not educated, if we don't have the best talented and trained and educated kids, so that when they enter the workforce, they have the training and the intellect to compete. And so that's why this issue is so absolutely critical. I think one of the problems we have in this country right now is we have failing institutions. We have a failing, healthcare system. We have a tax system that's an abomination. We have an education system that is just subpar at best, and that's not good enough in an environment where, I look at my 17 and 18-year-old kids. And they're not just going to be, growing up in Virginia, they're not just going to be competing against kids from Georgia and California and Ohio and Michigan. They're going to be competing against kids from Korea and China and Taiwan and Brazil. And it's just a travesty that we're not turning out kids that are getting a first-rate education. And there's no reason we can't do it. I mean, there's no reason every kid can't get the kind of top-notch system that this country deserves. Last point I'll make is that if you look at our university system, there is no question we have the top universities in the world. We have a very efficient, well-functioning university system. It's our K through 12 system that's failing. And I do think that one big difference is we use different models for those two types of systems. When my 17 and 18-year-old graduate from high school, they can choose among hundreds of colleges if they can get in. But that's a big question. But that's not true for 80% of parents who don't have more than one choice about where they send their kids to school. So that's why I think this is so important. That's why I'm here. And Dana, thanks for having me.
That reminds me of one story. I'll tell you that when President Bush would tell a story about as he met with world leaders at Camp David, or if they had time after dinner and have a cigar or whatever they did, he said that he used to like to ask leaders, "What keeps you up at night?" So it was a good way to try to really get to what was on their minds, and what do they think about. And so he tells a story about when he had President Hu up at Camp David, and he says to the President Hu, "I'll go first. I worry that there's going to be another attack on my country. I worry about it all the time. If I wake up at night, that's exactly what I think about. I think about it when I wake up. I think about it when I go to bed. I never stop thinking about it." He said, "What do you worry about?" And President Hu said, "I have to try to create 25 million new jobs, net new jobs, a year, every year, without fail, to prevent chaos in my country." And we just lost 200,000 jobs, right? And there's 25 million new jobs. And so that's the reason that they're so focused on this. And their focus has not been on opening up the whole mind and the opinions and it's the math and science that they are focused on. And I have an opportunity right now through Burson Marsteller to work with Intel. And the new CEO is Paul Otolini, who really has taken this issue as one of the most important ones and talking about innovation in the economy and not just looking at how do we get through the next business cycle, but what do we do 10, 15, 20 years from now, especially because if you're an American company and you want to hire American workers and you're under the rule of Moore's Law, not Steve Moore's Law, but the Moore's Law of innovation, where things double, and you think, are we going to have a workforce in America where we can actually hire those workers? And we don't have to have the H-1B visas. Those are the ones for the highly skilled people. They run out of those at the State Department in about 40 seconds every year when they come forward. And through comprehensive immigration reform that President Bush tried to put forward and we didn't get it passed, that was one of the things that we needed to deal with, but it would be better to try to deal with it on the front end and not have to have the need for that many types of visas. Since this is about, we can talk about a range of issues, but since we're here to really talk about getting the message out, I thought I would ask the panelists first, and I was curious that Joe thought that we were actually doing better getting news out on education. And I wonder if you think that is true from a national media perspective, or do you see that more in the community newspapers, where I think Americans are still really reading those newspapers and where people are really focused on their schools? And if so, do you have any recommendations on what these people here or what we all could do to try to get the national media to pay a little bit more attention to it?
Yeah, I do think it's actually both that we're starting to see a shift on this. I think, so part of my evidence for this is if you look at the opponents of reform, they're on the run right now, and particularly organized labor and teacher unions, which are extremely effective when they're on offense. You can start to see how awkward they can get when they're on defense. And they're playing defense right now. And I think a lot of this has to do with the president talking a completely different game from a Democratic leader. I think some of you have seen the poll results that are in Education Next from earlier this year that were asked about charter schools. And if you ask the country about what they think about charter schools and you just give a bland definition of charter schools, you sort of get this much support. But if you started off by defining charter schools as something that President Obama supports, it goes from here up here. And this gets at sort of why I'm optimistic. I think that we're doing a better job getting messengers out talking about what charter schools are actually trying to do, which is closing the achievement gap, in some ways saving our country and saving public education from extinction. If you look at some of the early days of charter schools, just as another example on this, it was sold in the press in state houses around the country as a cheaper way to do as good or better a job with education, which isn't exactly, doesn't give people the warm and fuzzies when they read about it. They don't see it as a solution to a problem that exists. We've got more data than we've ever had before about the nature of the problem that we have in our hands in this country. And our messengers are getting out there and framing education reform, at least in chunks, as ways to solve that problem. And I think it takes us a great distance.
Steve, how often do people come to the Wall Street Journal editorial board to talk to you about education?
Well, not as much as they should.
Right.
I mean, we get people from, Bank of America and the financial industry that come all the time. But it's interesting that we don't get visited that often by people who are concerned about education. We have a full-time person, Jason Riley, who you know well, who covers education for us, and we write an editorial every 2 or 3 weeks on the importance of education. We just wrote one the other day about maybe a breakthrough here in D.C. with the senator from Illinois, Durbin, saying maybe he'd be open-minded to extending the voucher program in D.C. But I think your question is a good one, Dana, because the point I was trying to make is that education is maybe the most important economic issue that we have right now in terms of, it's just hard to see how we can possibly maintain our global lead without, the best skilled and trained workers. When I talk to young people, and I give a lot of talks to college and high school kids, and I try to explain to them, I always ask them the question, why is it that a worker in the United States is paid 8 to 10 times more than a worker in Mexico? And, some of them give crackpot, because we have a higher minimum wage or things like that. And, of course, that's not the answer. And, the answer to that, as you all know, is there's 2 reasons. One is that the average American has a lot more physical capital to work with, computers and machinery and things like that make Americans more productive on the job. And the second explanation is that we have more human capital. And human capital is exactly the training and skills and education and intellect that allow that person to be more productive on the job. And those are the 2 keys to rising living standards. It's really that simple. And so, when we write about business and economic growth all the time, and I wish we would focus even more on the importance of an education system that's failing.
And I think that you are going to continue to see, I hope that you continue to see the private sector taking a longer view of what their role is in helping the education system, because if you're a CEO and you're looking at the long term, now we're not too far away from having a situation where we're not going to have enough people to keep us as competitive as we want to be. I remember when we named in the Bush administration, they work through the State of the Union process, and these the policy people all get together, and the communicators really don't get involved until sort of December or January. And by the time we got involved, when we announced the competitiveness initiative, I said, he's not going to be able to say that. And they're like, what do you mean? I said, no, he won't be able to pronounce it. It's too many syllables and too many ifs and is's. And I was right. Competitiveness did not come out very well out of the State of the Union. One of the things I wanted to ask Michelle about is something I think that you guys probably see, which is that in public opinion polls, if you ask people, hey, what's the most important thing to you right now? Because healthcare has been in the news, sometimes that gets up there, but it's usually jobs and the economy. But education usually does poll pretty high. And if you look at a lot of the state races, especially from a county commissioner or a city council or a superintendent or a state senate, state representative, they're definitely running on education. That's not necessarily, it doesn't always translate then, though, to Congress. And I don't know why that is, and I wondered, Michelle, if you could give us some thoughts about what you think could happen from either from outside the Beltway inside the Beltway push from a media or messaging perspective, so that members of Congress want to work together on something like this.
Without any undue disrespect, I would say that I think most members of Congress get very little about what is important to the American public. It's interesting to hear Steve talk, for example, about education as a competitiveness issue at a grass tops level, from a congressional and policy-making level. Those are the kind of things that policymakers, when they do think about education reform, that's what they think about. I think in terms of how we get Congress to pay attention, a lot of members of Congress, or most members of Congress, don't pay attention until their job is at stake. And I think that's one of the reasons, and I am very bold about telling people at a grassroots level that these people work for you and you need to let them know that you have no problems firing them. And I think one of the reasons that we are seeing more education issues covered in the national press and beginning to resonate with some members of Congress is because, number one, we do have better messengers, and I think also people who believe in education reform have finally gotten to a point where we say to ourselves, do we want to win? Because we've been losing for a long time. There is a lot to be positive about, but I think when it comes to education, when it comes to the fact that we're talking about children, the picture isn't that wonderful. There's nothing really to celebrate. There are little wins here and there. There are small gains in here and there, but traction is picking up in the press because we have found a way to define this as an issue about children. Not about adults, but as about children. When you see people reaching out to mothers in particular, when you see people reaching out to the people that this really affects, and I've told some of the people in this room that we've worked with recently on the project we did called About Our Children. One of the things that made this resonate with the folks at MSNBC, because when I went to the president of MSNBC and said we want to do a 2-hour program on education reform, he almost looked at me like, shoot me with a gun in my head. That's going to be a 2-hour policy discussion. And we said we want it to be live. It's going to be a town hall meeting, and we're going to bring in poor blacks, poor whites, and poor Hispanics who are suffering in abysmal, public schools to be able to come in and ask people questions. And they said it's going to be a boring 2-hour discussion about policy that nobody will watch. Well, how do you make it interesting so that the American public will watch and so that members of Congress will understand that this is something that people really care about? I don't know what most people in here, do day to day, but one of the things that we found very helpful was to really get hip about it. Go out, and we started interviewing people who live in very poor neighborhoods with horrible schools and ask the very difficult questions. Why do you have so many children? Why do you continue to have so many children? Do you get involved in parent-teacher conferences? Are you able to talk to your teachers? What are your hopes and your desires for your children? And put them up on the internet. If you give people an opportunity to sort of rise up from the ranks and have an argument and have a fight and take it to members of Congress or take it to the teachers' unions, all of a sudden somebody at one of the networks says, this is great TV. And so I think that is one of the things that we need, everybody here in this room needs to do, is empower people to almost rise up in the streets. If anybody here remembers like the old black and white pictures of the civil rights movement in the 60s and people, having water hoses turned on them and dogs being chasing people down in the streets, it's a horrific image. But it got international coverage, and it's almost something like that I feel that we really need to have in the education reform movement, and that those are the types of things that gets the media's attention. If we have somebody who's willing to go on television and look at the president of the NEA and say, we think that you want poor blacks and poor whites and poor Hispanics to remain stupid and uneducated so that teachers who don't do their jobs can continue to be employed, someone is going to put that on television. Some parent is going to watch that. Other mothers are going to organize. They will mobilize, and you will continue to see it in TV, and you'll see mobilization efforts all over the country. That's one of the things that we're working on, and I think that that's one of the reasons that you are beginning to see more coverage, not of mundane, No Child Left Behind Act discussions, but really the real people whose lives our asinine public education system is destroying.
Starting with
Could
Steve.
I just, for 1 second on that, just the premise of your question about how education shows up so highly in public
Yeah.
opinion polls. I think in some ways that the American public is lying about this. I think they say they care about education because you feel like you're supposed to. It's like flowers and puppies. It's all good. When I published a book a couple years ago on education politics, and my publisher in New York knew that I was just obsessed with the issue, and he just sat me down. He's like, the thing you got to understand is all that stuff you're talking about with these polls and everything, it's not true. When it comes down to people to plunk actual money down to buy a book about education, it's not, it's if their kids are doing okay, it's a close to home kind of thing. So I think one of the challenges for us in sort of getting the message out is sort of playing off the fact that they're lying. If they say that they care about education, but it's somewhat passive, that they're not going to get themselves in on a bloody fight if they don't have to. It's sort of giving people a clear path that they can just sort of say, I don't know much about this, I don't even really care, but somebody's doing something, and I think I'm happy with it. We did polling here in D.C. last year about Mayor Fenty and Michelle Reed, and there was a lot of people that said they didn't even know about or didn't care about the details. They were glad that there were some people that were standing up and actually doing something in D.C. And I think that it gives us an opportunity to sort of exploit this lying public on education issues.
Right, great. Maybe starting with Steve and then working back this way. I would like each of you to talk about one thing before we go to your questions, which is obviously there's the federal versus local debate. But Steve, if there was one thing, Steve, everybody, if there was one thing that you think the federal government could do or pass, if we could, all the stars aligned, what would be the one policy thing that you think could actually really help?
Well, I believe that if we close down the Department of Education, it would have a very, very positive effect on schools. I mean, and I mean that very sincerely. I think federal involvement in education has been a negative. And I did a correlation, just a back-of-the-envelope correlation. Over the last, since Jimmy Carter created this, and the teachers union say, "Look at us, we have our own cabinet agency." If you look over the last 30 years and you correlate test scores with federal education spending, it's been negative. So there's just no evidence that all of this money has had a lot of good. I'm a big believer, Dana, that local control is the most important thing, and that's why there's a big movement in the education movement on the left to actually more centralize the decision making and have, there are a lot of people who want the federal government to just take over the school systems, and I think that would just be a disaster. I'm lucky enough to live in Fairfax County. Do you live in Fairfax County? Or?
I'm on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So, but in
But I don't
Fairfax
have
County,
children.
I mean, we have the best, arguably the best public schools in the country. We pay a lot for them, and we have we're probably the only school district in America that has too much parental involvement.
Don't mind Montgomery County.
But I mean,
Yeah.
the fact is,
you're right.
that it's. But you can see the impact of local people having control of their schools. So I just think that there's a reason that we set up a system that was very locally oriented, and then states can certainly pump in money for localities that can't afford to provide schools. But I mean, look, Dana, Washington D.C. spends more money virtually than Fairfax County does, and D.C. has abysmal schools. I'm from the Chicago area. Chicago spends a huge amount of money on its public schools, and there's not real results to show for it. One last point. We were all talking about the healthcare crisis, and as you said, Dana, and the president has made this strong case that we're spending more money per patient than any other country in the world, and this proves that we're highly inefficient because we're not getting better healthcare outcomes. And yet we're spending $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 more per patient. And I was thinking about that the last time the president said it, and I said, okay, if that's the premise, we spend more, we're getting worse outcomes, so the system doesn't work. What about education? I mean, my goodness, we spend, far more per pupil than any other country in the world. I mean, we're spending, on average, about $4,000 more per student than the average OECD country, and they have better educational outcomes. So doesn't that suggest that we have a high? Why not fix the education system too? We could get much better outcomes if we spent this money more wisely.
Joe?
I was talking to a reporter the other day about Race to the Top, and she wanted me to respond to some comments that some teacher union leaders made, and she said that these union leaders were complaining that Race to the Top was circumventing the legislative intent at the state levels. And I thought, isn't this ironic? I mean, these guys wrote the playbook about circumventing legislative intent. I actually, all politics is local. All education politics is particularly local. I do think that it is a local issue. I think the federal government does play an important role in setting a tone about what reform looks like, and even getting some of the squishier stuff about making you feel that reform is possible at the end of the day. One of the things we said about the president in the beginning is my organization's hope was that he would do the equivalent of what Kennedy did, saying we're going to put a man on the moon at the end of the decade, by getting everybody to fixate on where we want to go so that these fights about how we get there are a little bit easier to swallow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I had my druthers, I would ask Congress to pass legislation that criminalizes, teachers' unions. But since I don't think that'll happen in my lifetime, I think I'd have to say I really, I agree with Joe. I think what I would really love to see, particularly from this president, is to continue to set the tone. If anyone saw the speech he gave before the NAACP over the summer celebrating the 100th anniversary of the NAACP, he didn't use the name teachers union. But when he talked about the fact that there is no longer a place for teachers who are not doing their jobs properly, that was a sort of covert way of saying we've got to do something about teachers' unions. And if he would come out more positively to talk about, merit pay, introducing competition into the education system, dealing with ineffective teachers, and speaking positively about the DC voucher program, for example, the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, and why that program should continue to move forward and be spread all throughout the country. That is something that I think would be very, very important and helpful.
Can I add one thing to that? Because it is important. We have the first black president in American history. This is a spectacular thing. I mean, I think everyone agrees on that. And if anyone, much more so than George W. Bush, if anyone can fix this system, It's Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. There's just no question about it. He has the moral authority to do it. He has the standing in the black and Hispanic community. And when you talked about, what do people, think about and pray about at night, if we could just convince, and you're working on this with us, with Barack Obama, I mean, really, if he would be open-minded to some of these big reforms, I mean, it would be like Nixon going to China. And this is the one man in America who can fix these schools, and it is a tragedy so far he hasn't been open-minded. At the very edges he is, but when it gets to things like vouchers and a vast expansion of choice, he's generally so far sided with the teachers' unions. And I'm just crossing my fingers, Dana, really. And thinking hopefully he will transform our education system, because he would be a national hero for decades if he did.
I wrote a piece in August when I was thinking about, after the healthcare debates, after the stimulus, after all this, sort of after all that is done, where does the administration go from there? Like, what's the issue that they're going to work on? What could he possibly do to try to heal the rifts, bring people together? And I said, I thought about it for about a week, and then I finally wrote the piece and I said, it's education.
Yep.
And he has the opportunity to do that. But we have the opportunity to take your questions. So there's a microphone here. There's she's a rule changer. Okay. She's in charge.
I think most of us in here are kind of out-of-the-box thinkers anyway.
Great. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and then you can feel free to direct them to anybody on the panel.
I have a question, but first of all, I'd like to bring you up to date on a thing. Education Revolution is alive and well. I represent an area in Wake County, North Carolina, Maryland, Avila, and our school system has in excess of 139,000 students in it. And over the years, a number of years, we've had in place a diversity policy. And it's not a bad idea. The implementation that has evolved over time has become a bad process. In order to maintain their idea of diversity, we reassign 30,000 to 40,000 kids a year. We have children who have been moved 3 times in 4 years, sometimes 4 times in 4 years. The parents went up in arms. We had elections this past Tuesday, 4 open seats on the school board. 3 of them were unanimously, 58 to 64%, voting for the people who want to go back to what they refer to as community schools. The fourth seat was a four-way race, and the gentleman who proposed that policy as well as his platform won 49%. So he will go into a runoff. But the issue here is that we've had so long focus on the system and not the students. And the parents have just had it up to their eyeballs, and they said, it's got to stop. But the problem is they've got painted with this bigoted brush about their anti-diversity. And they're not anti-diversity, they're pro-children. So that's the way we need to look at it. And my question is, you've banged on the unions, and I have a question. Do you see across the state spectrum, does it matter whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, the power of the union in order to have reform in the state? North Carolina's Democrat, and we literally passed up millions of dollars in the stimulus package because they refused to raise the cap on our charter school system. So does it go across partisan lines in terms of where they put the pressure and hold down reform by union influence?
It depends whether you're talking about a Democratic governor. It depends on whether the governor wants to push reform or not. I mean, it's not just a clear cut across the board generalization I can make on this. I do think though that when you have a Democratic governor, Democratic leader who wants to push the envelope, it's a lot harder for the unions to deal with that scenario. When it's a Republican. The perception is that the union's being bashed, the union ends up being stronger. It helps the union go back to its members and say, you guys got to get fired up, they're trying to kill us here. Where it's a Democrat, particularly if they endorse the Democrat, it's a little bit more confusing. I mean, not that anybody in here is going to have a lot of sympathy for national union leaders right now, but look at what they're going through with Obama right now in this race to the top stuff. They're apoplectic. This is a guy that they feel that they bought in a change that they could believe in, and this is not the change that they were talking about. And it's hard for them to know what to say. I mean, if they're out too publicly criticizing the president, they look crazy. I mean, when the NEA criticized Obama on the race to the top in their written remarks that were submitted to the Department of Education, they released that 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a Friday, which is where you put news that you don't want everybody to see, but you put it there so that your state people can. Yeah, the pros.
I gotta use that.
That's what the pros say. So this is something where they didn't want the entire American electorate to know that they were bashing Obama on this, but they wanted their state leaders to know that they're here in Washington fighting, and that it's up to you guys to fight it out in 50 states now. So it's an interesting dynamic that way.
I was just going to ask one other question of Steve, first to you, and then maybe the other panelists can talk about it quickly, because obviously there's people here from a lot of different places. And one of the things, when you talk about competition, Michelle, and competition in education, I wonder what you would say that people from their own communities can do if their states, for an economic region like Fairfax County, to compete for businesses that want to place their headquarters in Fairfax County or other places. Can an argument be made that education and good schools is a good economic driving force to try to bring businesses in and jobs in? I mean, is there a way to connect that so that the media maybe picks up on that a little bit, and that you inject competition amongst cities and states?
Oh, of course. I mean, there's no question about it. And the evidence is very clear that when schools perform better and get better test results and have better graduation rates, property values in those areas improve. So it becomes self-reinforcing, because as property values rise, then the counties and cities get more money that they can put into the schools. So educational quality is absolutely essential to how well certain communities do. I mean, I'm a big believer that tax rates and things like that matter too for businesses, but schooling, because look, the CEOs, the people who make these decisions, they have kids too. It's that simple.
I would just be careful about the competition stuff. I think it's one thing to talk about competition between states and districts, but when you're talking about schools competing for kids, it does not play well with the parents that we want on board with this, because they understand that when you compete there's winners and there's losers. Their kids are the ones who are losing out all the time anyway. And this is sort of, if there's this just sort of sour feeling over this entire education discussion, which there tends to be, the notion that there's a competition that their kids are likely to lose out on, like everything else, every other system that we give them, governmentally speaking, it doesn't always win.
I'm a big proponent of competition in everything. And I'll just give an example of, because of a group that I'm fascinated with called the Parents Revolution. They're in California. It's a new group, but I think that they're doing something pretty revolutionary, and time will tell how it works out. But they basically work with parents, and they will tell you, we want public schools to succeed. So they will tell you that, but they work with parents in California, and parents get together and they will basically go to their local public school and say, you know what, you are doing a disservice to our children. You've got 3 years to get your act together, and if you don't, we will build a charter school next door to your school, and that's where our children will go to school. It will be very interesting to see what happens with that, but when I talk about competition, that's what I mean. I would venture to guess that in some of these schools where the parents really get involved with the school system and with teachers and say, we're willing to pull our children out of the school, that all of a sudden that introduction of competition into the system might be just the incentive needed to turn around the way things work in certain schools.
Yeah, on the messaging, I think it's key to focus on pulling the kid out of the school, because that's something tangible. You can see your child can get something better for having done it, but if you're saying we're going to pull your child out of the school so that school can compete with some other school down the road, which doesn't even recognize competition, if it bit it on the face. I'm talking about in messaging terms.
Yeah, and I didn't mean it that way.
Yep. Great. Somebody in the back there?
Yeah. Regarding I'm sorry, I was over here.
There you go.
Dana, it's me, the voice in your head. Obviously, the establishment and teachers' unions are well-funded, and they use those resources to purchase paid media to shape public opinion. What strategies and tactics can, I guess, underfunded groups, to use the term, what strategy and tactics can we use to sort of get our message out into the media, speaking as people who have a lot of experience with it?
I would say the tactic that I like the most is to get real people, so that it's not really your group that's speaking out, but it is a parent or a child that has been affected by a story, by something that's happened in the school that captures national attention. And I will use, for example, the child that was murdered in Chicago last week. One of the things that's interesting about it that I have not, there's been national media coverage, and the president has come out and spoken about it. But one of the things that is interesting that I haven't heard a lot of talk about, but this has happened in Chicago, it's happened in Arkansas, is that all of a sudden children that live in urban neighborhoods that are scholars are actually being beaten up and killed by other students in their school districts for getting good grades. I was talking to a gentleman last week who told me that when he was growing up, the bad boys or the bad girls left the smart kids alone because they were actually proud of them. Well, now, there are people. I was told about a story in Arkansas recently where a group of African-American boys were going to get some sort of award for high achievement in school, and the parents went to the school district and said, please don't announce our sons' names because they will be killed. That's horrifying. The American public doesn't know about it. If you say, I want to pitch a story about education policy, people say, shoot me, I can't stand it. But if you tell that story and say that our children are being targeted, and these are maybe people that you work with, and our children are being targeted because they are excelling against all the odds, that is a way to get local and maybe even national media coverage and go up against the teachers' unions, even though you don't have the billions of dollars that they have.
I would also say that technology is a wonderful thing.
It's
and
cheap.
YouTube.
Yeah. And let's think back to this summer. Lots of coverage about town hall meetings. Where that footage did not come from anybody professional. That was from cell phones and iPhones and whatever that was taking that video and then putting it up online, and then the news organizations take it, or the newspapers get it and they take a picture. But there are wonderful ways to be able to use Facebook and Twitter and YouTube. There's all sorts of different ways to communicate, especially locally.
The
local
Iranians
community
did it
blogs.
during the election.
Yeah,
we can do it.
I always said that wouldn't it have been great to have been the person, the Iranian who had to go and tell the supreme leader what a Twitter account was.
Yeah.
And how that was like.
And then Barack Obama has one.
Yeah,
in Farsi.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that technology is a great way to do that. And like for example, I live on Capitol Hill in Washington D.C. and there's a website blog thing that they call Moms on the Hill, MOTH, which is not a really good acronym, but they didn't ask me. But it is extremely active. And it's like a call to action. And they'll post things like, did you see this story? Did you know about this? Hey, do you want to get together? There's a meeting happening at Peabody Elementary. Who's all going to be there? And then they have started a thing, and they have a big Halloween party on the block. And because education politics is so local, there are ways to tap into that and then to grow it. It'll be interesting to see what the Parents' Revolution in California that Michelle just mentioned, if they're able to do that. I do think that there are low-cost ways. That's the other great thing about the internet, right? If you can find the young people who know how to work the thing, which I need to find, but and then you can utilize that. It's really not as expensive as the thing. It's not as expensive to communicate and be effective as it used to be.
Just one other thing I'd add to that is investing in people who will develop relationships with your press every day. When I was a reporter, I would speak to the teachers' unions, PR people several times a day, every day. And they would talk about you guys, by the way. And before I would even get to meet people like you, they had already trashed you with every reporter. So it's being able to feed the beast, coming up and determining what the storylines are that are out there. And that's where the unions are incredibly powerful with their message. Is that they have a message. They know what their message is. Everybody knows what the message is. Sometimes the message will be whatever we're talking about today. End it by saying that's why we need smaller class size. And they're relentless. They're focused. They'll hit the reporters up day after day after day. And our side doesn't do enough of that. And it requires some investment in people in building those relationships.
Thank you. I'd like you to follow up just a little bit on the comments by Ms. Bernard earlier. You talked about putting people on YouTube and places like that were the parents of children in the poor schools, and it's easy to make that visceral because those schools are so bad. How do we energize the parents of kids that go to suburban middle-class schools where the schools aren't bad, but they're not great? They're just, and what do we do with those parents? How do we get them on board?
Everybody's different, but in some of the with some of the parents that we've talked to in schools, just like what you describe, those are parents who for them it's not a safety issue, it's an economic issue. So that's where the Stephen Moore example of talking about what is the 21st century workforce going to look like and how are you going to pay your mortgage, and typically what I say to parents is what's your vision for your life in the next 5 years? What do you want your child's life to look like when they're 20, when they're 30, when they're 40? And when you give parents an opportunity to really think about what they want their children's lives to be like, and they will always tell you, I want my child to live a better life than me. I want my child to have a better education than me. I want my child to live in a better neighborhood than me. And when you can bring it back around and talk to them about the importance of having the same education as a child that lives in Fairfax County, or that as Barack Obama, an opportunity for your child to go to a private school like Barack Obama did, that's when parents get energized. I think that you just have to break it down into the most simplest terms. And everybody's different, but we found a lot of success by just asking that very basic question: what do you want your child's life to look like? A lot of times I'm finding that we never use terms like school choice or education reform. There are a lot of parents who don't know what that means, or they just think that you're really boring and they don't want to talk with you. But if you put it in different terms, and I have found that working with mothers in particular, and I mean this in no way to be disrespectful to dads out there, because dads are just as involved, but it's the moms. No, they're not. Well, I won't say that. I'll leave that to you. But it's the moms who take the kids to the doctor's appointments, and they're trekking them around, and they worry about their education and who's my daughter going to marry and that kind of thing. The moms, if you just put a bug in their ear and just give an example, well, here's what they're doing in LA. Here's what they've done in DC. It's amazing what mothers will do of all at any socioeconomic level. You know how we talk about, every election time, everyone, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, Green Party, no matter what they are, they come after women voters, and there's a reason. We put people in office and we take them out of office. That same group of women will energize and start working for reform in their areas. But you really have to get to them and go door to door and talk to people. It really is that simple.
And I think you have to try to figure out ways to ask them to do something. I think that one of the things the Obama administration did during their internet outreach during the campaign was that I talked to this guy, Brett Milliner, who worked on it. He said that every time they communicated with different groups, he even said that there were like cat lovers for Obama. Literally, there was like a group. And if they communicated with them, they asked them to do something, something small. Sometimes it was just, hey, click here and sign on this online petition. Or could you give $5?
Yeah.
Or could you do something that didn't take too much of their time, right? Nobody has any time, especially busy moms and things. But if you first get their attention, and then as you keep in contact with them, ask them to do a little something. I think that helps somebody feel like they can make a difference.
The point you make is so important because, the reason that education reform, real education reform, and sweeping choice types of measures never have succeeded on the grand scale that most of us in this room would like to see is precisely because white suburban voters are against it. They're against, if you look at why vouchers have failed in California and Michigan, I mean, the demographics are very clear. White suburban parents voted against it. And the truth is their schools aren't very good either. And I think this gets to the point that you were making. And I don't have an answer, but I'll pose the question. How do we persuade Americans that mediocre doesn't cut it anymore, right? I mean, most schools in America are mediocre. They're not terrible. They're not like the inner city schools in Detroit or Chicago, and they're not Fairfax County. They're kind of mediocre. And we've got to do a hell of a lot better than mediocre, or we're not going to be able to have a high-wage, affluent society. And that's, I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's the key to winning. And maybe you...
No, I don't. It's a great question. I'll tell you, my short-term strategy on this is to ignore the suburbs right now. I mean, I think one of the lessons we learned from No Child Left Behind was the pushback wasn't coming from the inner cities. It was coming from Ridgewood, New Jersey, where they ended up on the failing schools list because they were doing a lousy job with special ed kids. And all of a sudden, people are calling up the real estate brokers saying, we bought this nice house. How could our school be on the failing list? I think we've got to move things along pretty far and almost sneak it on suburbia at this point. But if we don't do it, we're not going to win. We have to. And I have never heard anybody articulate a great way to win over the suburbs on that. And it's like Saul Alinsky's definition of a revolution when you have the haves and the have-nots, and the have-a-little-want-mores side with the have-nots, and then everything tips. We haven't figured out. We're doing really good at dealing with the have-nots and communicating with them. The haves could care less about this issue. I don't know how we do this. This is our Achilles heel right now.
I'm from Montana. We don't have any inner cities.
All right. So short term, I'm forgetting Montana.
Part of the thing too, although I do think that one of the things that's key, especially for Montana, I'm born in Wyoming, Newcastle, Wyoming. Rural school districts have issues as well,
They
obviously, and part of that is, for example, broadband access. And one of the things that's happening right now, the administration in the stimulus package passed a thing that said that the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has to, by February, release a national broadband plan. And making sure that students have access to high-speed internet, like their city counterparts, is going to be very important for their economic futures. And it's a great equalizer. And it's just one thing that I would point out for a rural district.
Could you do broadband vouchers? Could that be?
Yeah.
Hi. I would address this to everyone on the panel, but maybe Ms. Perino specifically.
Okay.
If you were running for elected office and you had to appeal to suburban, rural, and urban voters and pick one top-line message for education and the need for education reform, would it be something to do with long-term economic development, the need to stay competitive in an increasingly, or the need to produce an educated workforce in an increasingly competitive environment, which I would think would be a general and universal but sort of distant concern for a lot of voters? Or would it be something more specific and immediate but with a narrower focus towards parents, like your kids are going to crummy and sometimes unsafe schools? Or would it be something else?
So, okay, this is fun. We get to pretend. I used to never answer hypotheticals, but now I will. I would think I would do it both, and I would do it as like an inverted pyramid. So at the top, I think I would say something about, we have to change this, because if we don't, your kids aren't going to have a job. And the kind of jobs that they're going to get, they're not going to be able to pay the bills, and they might live with you till you're 40. But then I think I would narrow it down, and I would maybe give an example or some of the statistics that Steve mentioned about what the Chinese education minister said, and just say that, I might even throw a little patriotism in there. Okay. But I think that's how I would do it, is start big and drill down into something very specific. But then you also have to be for something, right? You can't just run on fear. You have to be for something. So then you would have to come up with, and here's the 3 things, if elected, that I would work to make happen within the first year of being in office. And to be very specific, and people want to know that. We're watching right now an election in Virginia for governor, and the Republican and the Democrat battling it out. And arguably, from the Republican side of things, he's been very specific about transportation, education, even down to the point of one of his ideas on education is that every graduating senior from a Virginia high school will get a Kindle as they go to college. And the hope is that would cut down on book costs for parents when they send their kids to college. So I think that you have to be for something, you have to start big, and then get really specific.
I would show a picture. Well, I guess that you wouldn't be a politician with a PowerPoint, but if you could be a politician with a PowerPoint, I would show a picture of Haiti today, and I would give the statistic that I find fascinating, which was that in one point in time, by every economic measure that we have, Haiti was the greatest nation in the world. Haiti is at the bottom of the barrel now. And that is what will happen to our country, and that is what the United States will look like. It will be your children running down the streets looking for clean water, looking for jobs, and living in shacks if we don't change the entire education system in this country.
She would beat me.
I think I'd beat both of you, but I'm not going to say it out loud in this room. If you want to hear it, buy me a beer downstairs later. I'll tell you, it is incredibly devious, the idea that I have. And it's built on the assumption that people in the communities that you're describing actually don't want to hear that their schools need work. So I'm thinking about backdooring your way in on this and using fear in an entirely different way.
Okay. Each of you has touched on the notion of school choice. How do you each define school choice, and what can state policymakers do to expand school choice, or should they?
I would just say the money should follow the kids. I mean, it's a pretty simple idea. Just do what we do with the kind of scholarships and grants we gave through the VA, and basically say, here's 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, 12. I don't know what the right number is, and go at it and find the school that's best. One of the things that I feel is so important about education reform, now that I'm the parent of 3 boys, 2 that are teenagers and 1 that's 7, and I think that when you think about it. Rodney Dangerfield, having 2 teenagers, he said, after having teenagers, he knows now why some animals eat their young. And it really is true. I can't wait for them to leave. That's why I think I love your example of, God, they're going to live with you till they're 40. That's a scary thought. But all 3 of our kids are completely different. I mean, we have one. Our oldest is a typical oldest. He's off the charts. He goes to Thomas Jefferson High School. He's competing with all these Asian kids. It's just wonderful. And then, our middle one is not very motivated and has totally set of different interests. And, our littler one is completely ADD. And so the point is, they all have very different needs. And this whole idea the whole concept, that we're going to kind of warehouse the kids and put them all in a similar classroom. I just don't think that whole model even works anymore, really. I mean, put kids who are interested in music and music schools and science and engineering schools and this and that. I mean, let kids do what they're interested in and what will motivate them.
I agree. Dollars following students, but I would add on to that. Dollars following students to publicly accountable schools, whether they're public or private. I was just talking with a Florida legislator about this the other day, where she was talking about. You drive your car around, you need to fill it up with gas, you should be able to fill it up wherever you need to. And I said, I agree with that, but you also got to make sure that the gas station is selling gas that's not going to destroy your car.
Ditto. That's how I define it. Tax dollars follow your kids, but the schools have to be accountable.
I would just give an example. Again, I don't have children, so I don't have any in the school district, but I live on Capitol Hill, and my neighbors, African American, there were 5 children. The 2 oldest boys were killed in a horrible car accident about 2 years ago. The grandmother is basically raising the other children, and let me tell you, she rules with the iron fist. I love her. And these kids are really great. They're polite. They've got a lot of hope and promise. Well, last year, when President Obama came into office, it was like in the spring, there was a rumor basically that they might not support the DC voucher system again. And this grandmother had taken advantage of this system, and the girls were in private, can't remember, somewhere up, they took the metro and the bus and whatever else to get to a really good school somewhere in the Northwest. And I think it was maybe even a Catholic school. Well, the only communication she really had was the debate going on in the Washington Post that she was kind of reading but not really following. And she didn't know what to do. She was worried. And then she said, I have to find another school for my kids. So she started going to this school. And she went to this charter school, and they said, no, there's like a list of 428 students who are on the waiting list. So we'll put you down at the bottom of the list. And so she panicked. Well, what ended up happening was the oldest daughter, I offered to help. I didn't really know how I could help, but I offered to help somehow. And she said, no, I got it. Well, it ended up that now the oldest daughter, who's a senior in high school this year, is at East High School. This is not the place for her. And I think that for me, looking from outside looking in on the education system, that here's a grandma trying to do the right thing to raise these kids, had a terrible tragedy last year. She doesn't have enough tools in order to handle figuring out how to get her kids into these better schools. And so she takes the path of least resistance because that was the only option she felt that she had left. So whatever choices are offered, I think they have to be really easy to follow, easy to use, and especially for people in the inner city. I mean, maybe suburban parents don't really care as much right now, but at least in the city, that's been one of the most disappointing things that I've seen. And I walk by Senator Landrieu's house every day when I take my dog for a walk. And I think, isn't it great that she sits on the education committee and she gets to send her kids wherever she wants because she's rich. Mm-hmm. And she lives on Capitol Hill, not 6 blocks from this other woman. I'd love to introduce them one day.
I'll come with you.
Yeah, I want to thank you for saying that because I work with parents. I'm a volunteer. I've been a volunteer for 40 years in public education. And the question that you asked, I think it was Joe, about why do parents accept mediocrity, you're making a terrible assumption that parents even understand what mediocrity in education is. Mm-hmm. And that's the underlying problem. When the economic downturns hit, and this is like I think my 3rd or 4th, I'm not sure, the school districts do what school districts do. They cut away programs. And what happens is, and I call them RWP, rich white people, all come down, and it doesn't matter what color they are or what their ethnic background is. They're just RWPs. They come down, and they want to replace those programs in their school. And the only thing you hear out of their mouth is my child, my child, my child. They're perfectly content because if their child needs tutoring, they buy it. And if they need to their child needs music lessons, they buy it. I have choices. I could move my children anywhere I wanted to. When the school went bad, I moved. Was I happy with the education my children got in public schools? No, but then I took care of them and tutored them at home. That's what I did. They went to school for socialization. It's not going to change until we stop RWPs, until we stop talking about our children and we start talking about all the children. And when I do workshops with parents, what I say to them, you may not understand why this is important to you, but when you go outside your door, those children who didn't get a good education, who are helpless, hopeless, and then insulted, they're going to come after you and your children. That's what happens, because that's the reality of what happens. How do you change it? Let's start defining for parents what a good school looks like. Quit messing around with everything else. Just start pumping up a couple really killer schools where teachers are facilitators, where teachers do 4 years of college and then a year of learning with a master teacher. Let's show them what a good school looks like.
If it's okay, we have questions for 2 more.
Okay.
I have one back here and one on the front.
Okay.
Okay, so other than the fact that I would urge you to write about New Jersey and how messed up it is at every opportunity, I'm shocked by how difficult it is to get the media to focus in on how little anything has changed since 1950. And I say this because the other day I had a debate in New Jersey with the Commissioner of Education and the President of the Teachers Union, who was telling everybody how great our schools are. And I was just like, our schools are great if you are white and you do not live in a city. If you live in a city in New Jersey, if you're black or Hispanic, you go to one of the most expensive schools in America, right? And we have like 20 schools in year 5 or later in Newark, you know, all 5 middle schools in Camden in year 8. And it frustrates me, and I'd like for you all to sort of hop on this, why the media doesn't understand that this is like a crisis of black and Hispanic kids dying right now, right? Like, why is it so difficult to get people above and beyond the fray of, oh, we're paying for this, or we need more money, or whatever, and to get just to the fierce immediacy of the fact that these kids are having their futures robbed, even as we sit on that phone talking about whatever we're talking about.
You know, it's interesting. This actually brings us full circle to where we started, which is, I think there is a way to get people to focus on it as a crisis, and there's one person right now in our country who could really do that, and it's President Obama. And maybe once they get through the health care issues and the Afghanistan review and Iran and all the other things that are going to come up that they don't even know about yet, that none of us know about yet, they could focus on it. But I do think that he could really make a difference.
You know, in addition to that, I mean, you're obviously right. And Barack Obama could really change the whole discussion. But, you know, I was listening to you speak with all due respect about this. And I have to tell you, I was giving I was at one of these education summits, but it was in outside of Detroit. And it was the mayor of Detroit and the head of the union and myself. And I think I was the only, conservative one there. And I made the kind of same pitch that we're all making here. And it was just depressing. I mean, it was, I would say 80% of the audience was black. And they weren't really very interested in what I had to say. I mean, they really said, just give us more money. You know, that's what they... So I think I'd say right back at you, the question to me that I was so depressed after that meeting, like, oh my God, I mean, all we've been doing is pouring money into these schools. And so the question is, how do we get not just Barack Obama, he's obviously the most important black leader, but black leaders all over the country to be shouting out about this? Where are they? Why aren't they? Do you have an answer for that? Why aren't the major black leaders in the country speak? Right, right. Right. But it's not going to change. It's not going to change until they start speaking out.
As like the one black person on the panel.
There's nothing like about it.
And I don't want to diminish, because you talked about blacks and Hispanics, but just as the black person on the panel, a couple things that I just wanted to add, and this is easier being said from somebody who is black versus someone who is not. But for all of our African Americans who are interested in education reform, we have a very serious moral obligation to go to the networks and say, your quote unquote, and it's theirs, your quote unquote traditional civil rights leaders do not speak for me. Okay? I can tell you from my personal experience with all of the networks, if a network feels that Jesse Jackson is going to picket them, they will not air a story. If a network feels that the NAACP is going to picket them, they will not air a story. Do the teachers' unions, and I don't know, do the teachers' unions give money to Operation Push? Do they give money to other groups? I mean, it's absolutely amazing that we've seen Al Sharpton actually be someone who's speaking out for education reform. But if you go into on a state-by-state basis, it's something that frustrates me probably even more than it frustrates Steve. And I know this is not completely an answer to your question, but I think that we have a moral obligation to stop saying, you do not have a right as the media to tell me that somebody black who you've decided you like is my leader. They do not speak for me, and it is my children that you are trying to destroy by saying, oh my gosh, so-and-so might picket me over at Fox News or NBC or CNN or anywhere else. Virginia Walden Ford, for anybody who knows her, has a great story. There was a time when African Americans could not teach in white schools. So for a lot of older generation African Americans who were able to teach in an integrated environment, that was such a massive achievement that they feel that you are doing a disservice to the public schools when you say that these schools don't work. And Virginia told me that what she did was she took her mother to a school in Arkansas and said, is this what you fought for? And when people look at the conditions that the schools are today, they all of a sudden, from an African-American perspective, say, no, this is not what I fought for. And so we have an obligation to show people and maybe just ignore the Congressional Black Caucus or ignore, quote-unquote, traditional civil rights leaders and work with parents because it's their children who are suffering.
Can I take a quick stab at answering your question, Darrell, from the perspective of somebody who spent most of my adult life working in a mainstream newsroom? When I was a journalism student in the 80s, I thought it was about finding truth, capital T. This is what you go into journalism. In the 90s, I saw this play out in our newsroom. We were getting attacked at the Milwaukee papers by talk radio for being biased. It was left-wing bias. Everybody's heard this stuff before. We began shifting from trying to find truth to trying to be fair. And we measured fairness by counting paragraphs. So you take an issue, you give 3 paragraphs to one side, 3 paragraphs to the other. You've done your job. You wash your hands of any responsibility to tell your readers what is actually happening. So this issue that you're describing, whether kids are dying in our inner city schools in academic death, when it's treated as an issue with 2 sides. This side says they're dying, this side says they're not. And it ends right there. So I say that only because this is sort of this dynamic as you attack and work with the media that you're working with. I think that's something that you gotta challenge them to live up to an obligation many of them had when they began in journalism, to actually search for that truth.
Last one, and we've got to make it quick.
Oh, shoot, I had so many things to say, then I'll just go to the bottom line. We've got such a leverage right now with the caps required to be taken off and merit pay and those types of things in order to get the federal money. I would like to know if anyone knows what the AFT and NEA are going to do, because they are between a rock and a hard place now. And so as we go into legislative session starting in January, what is our rhetoric? What are we going to be expecting from them? How can we pull educators who are normally only public schools and NEA into this to help us?
You are between a rock and a hard place. I think that, the sense is it's hard for them to fight it at the national level right now, so they are going to be putting tremendous resources into fighting this out in every single state. I don't know what the messaging is going to be, but no, I think they're going to continue to fight to change what needs to be done to get the money. I think you're going to continue to hear complaints that there's too much of an emphasis on charter schools right now. There's too much of an emphasis on testing. And the problem with the latter is that the public buys it. They get a lot of sympathy from people when they hear about a child is more than a test, and then they sort of sneak in all their other concerns in under that. I feel your pain. I think it's going to be a disastrous session for you on that.
All right, if you will, everyone, please join me in thanking our presenters today. And fill out your evaluation forms.
Good stuff. Likewise. You may.
You are all so wonderful. Thank you so much.